Welcome to Mayor Brown's Tech Talks podcast. Each podcast is designed to provide insights on legal issues relating to technology and IP transactions and keep you up to date on the latest trends in growth and innovation, digital transformation, IP and data monetization, and operational improvement by drawing on the perspectives of practitioners who have executed technology and IP transactions around the world. You can subscribe to the show on all major podcasting platforms. We hope you enjoy the program.
Hello and welcome to Tech Talks. Today we'll be talking about the evolving landscape of facilities management outsourcing in a post-COVID world. I'm your host, Julian Dibbell. I'm a senior associate in Mayor Brown's technology and IP transactions practice. I'm joined today by Rohith George, a partner in our Northern California office, and also a member of our tech and IP transactions and outsourcing practices. Welcome back to the show, Rohith.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So let's start with the basics. For our listeners who might be unfamiliar, could you explain exactly what facilities management or FM outsourcing is?
Yeah, absolutely. So at its core, FM outsourcing is the bundling together of a whole range of services that are necessary for running a facility, and then obviously hiring a third party to manage those services. The facility could be a manufacturing plant, it could be an R&D lab, it could be an office building. Depending on the type of facility, the actual range of services you need could probably vary. But generally, across all facilities, there's a set of services needed to kind of support the core business activities of a company. So examples could include building maintenance, like electrical systems, plumbing, HVAC, elevators, and so on. Could include janitorial services, landscaping, security, and so on and so forth.
Having a dedicated team to take care of all the behind the scenes operations that keep a building running smoothly, in other words.
Yeah, exactly. And the goal is twofold, I think. First, it allows a company to focus on its core business activities, its strategic priorities, without having to dedicate time and resource to this essentially non-core, non-revenue generating activity. This is the goal, traditionally with all kinds of outsourcing, right? So the second kind of goal is you can often drive significant cost savings and efficiency improvements through this type of outsourcing. How? Well, as with other types of outsourcing, these services really started out very unbundled. You'd hire a different company to handle your chiller maintenance than you would hire your cleaning or your landscaping. But because certain providers, wanted to capture kind of margin for the full stack of services, because of consolidation really between and amongst providers over the past couple decades, and because of a desire from companies to have, a real single point of contact for all things facility related, these services ultimately started to become integrated into what's sometimes called the IFM model or the integrated facilities management model. But ultimately, because of this integration, because of the resulting economies of scale, the FM providers can negotiate lower prices for products and services. They can use their expertise to find efficiencies in order to reduce waste. And then they can ultimately, pass on those savings to their customers.
Yeah, well, that makes a ton of sense. But you mentioned it, some of the ways in which FM outsourcing is not that different from other forms of outsourcing. I'm curious, what is different about it compared to other forms of outsourcing?
Yeah, great question. I think there are a few different things worth mentioning, because I do think these differences kind of impact how you may want to negotiate these deals. First, FM services are, inherently physical and involve managing physical spaces. And this requires typically provider personnel that are badged and on site. They're operating with physical tools, physical equipment. These aren't really remote or offshore services, or at least the vast majority of the services aren't remote or offshore, like many IT or other back office services, for example. And then because of that kind of on-site nature of the services, FM providers end up kind of interacting with a wide range of parties on behalf of the company, whether that's employees or visitors or customers or third-party suppliers, even local authorities. And then the next thing really is around the nature of the service delivery. The multifaceted nature of FM services means that services are often provided by local parties, local subcontractors that are providing specialized services. Your elevator maintenance person, for example. As a result of this, an FM provider is often managing a whole range of third-party relationships in order to deliver the FM services in line with performance requirements and expectations. And the fourth thing I wanted to mention in terms of like differences, the pricing model is different for FM outsourcing than many other forms of outsourcing. The costs that are associated with these subcontractors is most commonly passed through by the FM provider, for the company to pay or reimburse as part of its facilities budget. And then that budget is managed by the FM provider and, using its expertise, using, as I mentioned, the economies of scale that they can negotiate contracts system-wide or enterprise-wide. Because of that, that budget can be reduced year over year to drive savings for the company. And in exchange for that, the FM provider earns kind of a management fee on top.
All right. Yeah. So those are some interesting wrinkles. And then on top of that, it's the topic of our discussion today is the evolution of FM services. What kind of changes are going on right now? And what's driving this evolution in facilities management outsourcing?
Yeah, we're seeing a confluence of factors kind of reshaping the FM outsourcing landscape, and one of the most significant, perhaps most obvious, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has fundamentally altered how and where people work. We went from fully office-based work pre-pandemic to fully home-based work for a while, and then finally to the kind of today's office-centered hybrid work model. And these kind of swings have prompted companies to reevaluate how they're currently utilizing their spaces and how best to optimize those spaces for the future. So, whereas before as a company, your footprint, plus or minus periodic changes to your portfolio. And then you could, go out to an FM provider who could scope, price, and bid on that fairly static portfolio. Well, now there's an acknowledgement that things are in flux and companies are looking for their FM providers to be a little bit more flexible and dynamic in response to this changing environment.
Yeah, so it's not just about, keeping the lights on anymore.
Yeah, no, not solely about that. No, the expectations that companies have for their FM providers have increased. In the past, FM outsourcing was seen as a relatively low tech field, but today technology is much more central to this service. We've seen FM providers increasingly adopting things like sophisticated maintenance platforms in order to proactively manage building systems, promoting IoT devices in order to gather data, real-time data on occupancy, on work conditions, and then also like working together with their customers to implement smart building platforms in order to optimize energy consumption and so on.
Right, data, right? There's a ton of data involved in these services, and that sounds, kind of like a data gold mine waiting to be tapped, right?
It is, yeah. And that brings us to another key trend, which is data-driven decision making. With the increased use of these types of technologies and platforms, there comes a wealth of data that FM providers can harness in order to make and ultimately help companies make more informed decisions about things like space utilization or asset performance or energy efficiency or actually how you're going to deliver the services. So they can use this data to identify areas for improvement. They can optimize how they're utilizing their resources. They can just ultimately create more sustainable and really responsive workplaces or work environments.
All right, sustainable. How is sustainability a factor that's playing into the changing landscape of FM outsourcing?
Well, as you know, and as probably everyone listening knows, sustainability is no longer optional. It's a business imperative for most companies. So, we are all under increasing pressure to kind of reduce our environmental footprints and meet ambitious sustainability targets. So FM providers kind of have a crucial role to play in this effort. They can help companies implement energy efficient solutions. They can help them reduce waste, use environmentally friendly cleaning products, track progress towards sustainability goals, at least as it pertains to their use of buildings and workplaces.
So these are all pretty interesting and actually kind of exciting changes going on, but especially where you've got changes around technology and data, are there any concerns about data rights in FM outsourcing?
Yeah, I mean that's a really important question. It's definitely something companies need to be mindful of. As I mentioned, historically, FM outsourcing contracts reflected the fact that the majority of IP kind of just flowed from the provider to the company. It was a low tech, right? So the provider would license its tools, its platforms, its technology, and that's kind of the extent of it. The agreements were really focused from the company's perspective on guaranteeing that the company had sufficient post termination rights or access necessary to ensure kind of a smooth transition at the end of the deal to bring the operations in house or to move them to another party. But today, with significant and potentially valuable data flowing from companies, to the provider, it's important to clearly allocate, what the ownership and use rights are as between the parties. On top of that, when you have FM providers collecting and analyzing data from your facilities, you need to ensure that any sensitive information is being handled responsibly. So as a result, contracts now, whereas before they didn't, but now they need to address data security and privacy head-on concerns kind of directly head-on. So this includes things like specifying what data can be collected, how it can be used, how it's going to be protected, ensuring compliance with relevant privacy regulations. But all stuff, that's traditionally important in a technology agreement is much more important in these types of deals as well.
Right. And so, in other words, it's not just about finding an FM provider with the right technical capabilities anymore. You've also got to find a partner you can trust with your data.
Yeah, exactly. And trust and transparency are paramount in these relationship, and that extends to another aspect of FM outsourcing that can be complex, which is around the use of subcontractors. As we talked about, unlike some other outsourcing models, FM often relies heavily on a network of subcontractors in order to deliver specialized services.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? I mean, you can't expect a single FM provider to have in-house expertise on everything from HVAC maintenance to landscaping to catering, right?
Yeah, precisely. So, the thing is, though, that this heavy reliance on subcontractors adds another layer of complexity to these types of deals. Companies need to ensure they have visibility into the subcontracting arrangements, that the FM provider is properly vetting and overseeing its subcontractors, and that the contracts clearly outline liability and responsibility in case something goes wrong. But on top of that, given the on-site nature of the FM services, companies typically have broader rights regarding the provider's personnel, including, in particular, the right to require the provider to remove their personnel or reassign them or get them off their facilities, including with respect to subcontractors. But it's kind of a double-edged sword. If provider personnel are on site, perhaps wearing company badges or company uniforms, and you're directing their work, reimbursing potentially their salaries, there's a heightened risk of co-employment claims, perhaps more than in almost any other type of outsourcing. So it becomes important then to seek the appropriate indemnities from the provider, to protect against those types of claims, protect against that risk, and also take steps proactively in how you manage your personnel and manage this provider's personnel and subcontractors, to limit that risk, to prevent those types of claims.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like a very key point. And you said that all of these contracted services are passed through at cost to the company?
That's right. Well, at cost plus a management fee, and and really as part of an overall budget that the FM provider has to live under. And that actually brings up a couple important points. First, the company wants to be sure that that it's truly paying at cost. So if the provider is, FM provider is getting the benefit of any rebates or other benefits in a background way. Uh, the company wants to know about that and get the benefit of those rebates or those benefits. The second point is that, as we've talked about, companies are wanting more flexibility in how they are managing their spaces. They may want to, flex up or flex down their requirements. But if you're asking a provider to flex up and do more work, there's an open question as to whether they will get paid for it. Because if it's not in the budget, they might not get paid for it, or if it causes them to go over the budget, they may not get reimbursed for it, and that can impede kind of both parties' ability to work effectively together.
Right. So from the provider's perspective, it looks like the company is trying to have its cake and eat it too.
Yeah, exactly. So, at the end of the day, budget certainty and having cost savings are a critical factor, and probably the driving factor in almost all FM deals. But if you want to build flexibility into your contract as well, then it's important to have a process for handling budget adjustments in a manner that ultimately, minimizes the opportunity for dispute. It defines triggers for budget adjustments and allows for some flexibility in the budget. The key thing, I think, is you really have to get to the core of what's controllable for the FM provider and what's not. And that may mean taking a more hybrid approach to budgeting rather than kind of having one single budget that has all of the spend underneath it that the provider has to manage year over year to reduce. You may have to treat controllable spend budgets differently from non-controllable spend budgets, and treat the requirements and the hard and fast rules that you're setting for each differently depending on how controllable it is.
All in all, it sounds like these FM outsourcing contracts are becoming much more complex than they used to be. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. They always have been a bit complex in my opinion, but you're right. With the increased emphasis on technology and data, there are certainly some additional layers added.
Okay, so if a company is thinking about entering into or renegotiating an FM outsourcing agreement, what are some key pieces of advice that you would offer?
Sure, yeah. So I would say here are a few kind of essential tips, general tips to keep in mind. The first is prioritizing flexibility. So as we talked about in today's dynamic work environment, flexibility is paramount. So the contract needs to allow for adjustments to service levels, space utilization, budget, as your needs evolve, and that has to be thought of at the beginning of the contract rather than reactively. The second one is, treating technology strategically. So don't view technology as an add-on or an afterthought. It should be a core part of your FM outsourcing strategy. And you need to ensure that your contract addresses things like technology implementation, IP ownership rights, specific performance expectations around technology, availability of technology, and the use of technology. The third one, relatedly, is around addressing data privacy and security. So, ensure your contract includes robust provisions for data security, privacy, compliance, especially, as I mentioned, if sensitive information could be collected, processed by the provider. The fourth one, focus on outcomes rather than dictating specific methods for how the services are to be performed. Consider defining the desired outcomes you want to achieve. So, rather than specifying how often something happens, whether that's how often a bathroom gets cleaned, define what clean means and require that for your agreement. So, this gives your provider more flexibility to innovate and find the most kind of effective solutions for your actual objectives. The fifth thing, we talked about sustainability. Clearly define your sustainability objectives, work with your FM provider, incorporate them into the contract. This includes things like energy efficiency targets, waste reduction strategies, use of products, the environmentally friendly practices, and so on. And then finally, important in all outsourcing deals, but particularly here, you plan for smooth transitions on and off. So transition on and off, because of the on-site nature and because of the subcontracted nature of FM services, these can be even more involved than you might ordinarily expect in an outsourcing deal. So, consider, for example, for a first generation outsourcing, the company likely has a host of different agreements across potentially different regions and countries. with different subcontractors for individual services. And those all need to be either assigned to the new provider or they need to be terminated. And so there's a diligence process associated with the FM provider kind of accepting an FM budget or accepting these contracts. And then there's diligence that potentially needs to be conducted on facility equipment, building equipment. So there can be a lot of steps to onboarding an FM provider. So it's important really to focus on this process in the contract, ensure there's appropriate governance in place, milestones to be met, dependencies identified, and so on. And similarly, on exit, if you don't plan and contract for the same process at expiration or termination, with the full assistance, with full transparency from your existing FM provider, without that, you could face, potential disruption at exit, when nobody's really motivated to assist at that particular point in time. So another key point, I think, to focus on.
Well, great insights, Rohith. Very helpful. Thank you for breaking down this complex topic and for sharing your expertise. And listeners, thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions about today's episode or an idea for an episode you'd like to hear about anything related to technology and IP transactions and the law, please email us at techtransactions@mayorbrown.com. Thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed this program. You can subscribe on all major podcasting platforms. To learn about other Mayor Brown audio programming, visit mayorbrown.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening.